Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming in. Just going over the point I raised earlier again. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box and our team will raise them. We'll have a dedicated Q&A session after the discussion, but feel free to keep dropping your questions and we'll be able to pick them up. This session is about critical gaps every BFSI leader must fix before the DPDP rules hit. So I have some fantastic, we'll get into discussing the session and why we are having it, what we will cover and all of that. But before we get into all of that, I would like to introduce my fantastic panelists. Very excited to have Dinesh and Kailash and Sid on the panel with us. So Dinesh is a partner at PwC and he leads the data privacy practice for financial services. He has over 15 years of experience in consulting and business development and account management in the financial services industry and has been helping various financial institutions decode DPDP compliance. So Dinesh, you have a bird's eye view of what's going on in the industry, and we are very glad that you can share your insights with us and join us today. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Yes. And we also have Kailash. So Kailash is the head of governance and vulnerability management at the IIFL group. He has over 8+ years of experience in InfoSec, QMS, and audit and compliance. And Kailash has been driving the DPDP roadmap at IIFL with his expertise in personal data management and risk management and personal data flows. So while Dinesh has a bird's eye view of the industry, Kailash is at the ground implementing it at a very large organization, BFSI organization, and he has a close handle on all the challenges that go into ensuring DPDP compliance. So Kailash, really stoked to have you join us. It's our pleasure. It's our pleasure. Critical gaps every BFSI leader must fix before the DP rules hit. So right now we are in a twilight phase. The DP rules haven't hit, but there is a lot of the act are here, the draft rules are here, and we are in this twilight phase. Nobody's really sure of what to do. We have been talking to a lot of BFSI companies. A lot of them are starting out now, but in several places, what we hear is we will start after the rules. But in this session, we will talk to you about why you cannot wait for the rules and why it is pertinent. Like it's imperative that you prepare your DPDP compliance launchpad right now in the pre-rules phase, so that as soon as the rules hit and the timeline kicks in, you're able to begin with your compliance. So we'll talk to you about data discovery, gap assessment and data mapping, third-party risk evaluation. We'll also talk to you about some of the recent regulatory activities that has been happening, like the digital lending directions by the RBI, which have made a bigger push towards consent and data minimization. So by the end of this session, you should have a clear answer to 2 questions. Firstly, is it a good idea to start right now? Yes or no? And if you start right now, what are the basics that you can do? What is the starting point for you? By the end of the session, we hope that you're able to cover this part. So coming back to my point about a lot of BFSI companies are waiting for the rules to come in. They're saying there's not enough regulatory activity. But let's have a look at the regulatory recap. Let's have a look at what has been going on. So here you see that on August 11, 2023, the DPDP Rules Act was notified. And then the governor and the deputy governor of the RBI have said that banks are going to have to comply, and banks and NBFCs and other financial services organizations should start their preparation for DP compliance. Earlier this year, in January 3, the draft rules come out. And finally, since then, we have seen a lot of regulatory activity around data protection that has happened. Right. So the Reserve Bank of India digital lending directions came out in 2025, and these talk about consent collection, consent withdrawal, right to erasure, and data minimization. So they've given a special place to the requirements under the SPDI rules and given them some more teeth. We'll talk a bit about that as we go on. And these are enforced right now. The NEGD, National E-Governance Division, came out with a BRD for a consent manager with the goal to open source the basic requirements of a consent manager. So they started a challenge. Many consent managers have applied, and whoever wins this challenge will be open sourced and placed as a digital public good, which can be used firstly by government departments and secondly by MSMEs, smaller companies that need to just use an open source consent manager to get started. And finally, June 13, 2025, we had the TRI RBI regulatory sandbox come out, which is pursuant to the TRI's push to unsolicited calls. So as part of that, they have created a framework to obtain consents directly on the cellular operators network. And now they're doing a sandbox with RBI. So this is an activity between RBI, TRAI, RBI regulated entities such as financial services organizations, and TRAI regulated entities such as cellular operators and telemarketers. So the sandbox for this has also been created. You will see that since May to now, there's been a lot of regulatory activity that has been happening, especially by RBI and TRAI, right? Especially if you move to the next slide. If you move to the next slide, the digital lending guidelines, slide after this, please. The digital lending guidelines have brought in consent and data minimization and given it more teeth, right? So the digital lending guidelines are requiring explicit consent, requirement to show the purpose, requirement to publish privacy policy, option to give or deny consent for use of specific data and revoke the consent, restrict disclosures to third party, data retention requirements, and data erasure requirements and data minimization requirements. These requirements were already there in the SPDI rules in some shape or form, but they've been given more teeth. They've been brought into the digital lending directions that need to be followed by lenders in their digital lending journeys, right? So that is one reason. RBI, TRAI, MITI, everybody is doing a lot of activity. Everybody is pushing you towards compliance. The second reason is that it's going to take really long. Can we move to the next slide? So we sat down and we made this sort of roadmap for what it would look like for a mid to large BFSI company to comply. We realize it will take you anytime between 18, you will need the full 18 to 24 months. And there's a lot of work that you can get started with right away if you're going to meet your timelines. And that work you should do right now. So with this, I would like to bring in Dinesh into this conversation, right? So Dinesh, my question to you is, what are the different types of responses that you've observed in BFSI organizations so far to the DPDP Act and to DPDP Act compliance? And how long do you think it will take for a BFSI organization to become compliant?
Yeah. So see, for larger, let's say banks and the larger institutions, what I have seen is they have already started working at least 4, 5, 6 months earlier than today. So they have already started working on the gap assessment, on their processes, on their data discovery, etc. And the essential conversation even there, as to why they have started and why they have reached where they have reached already, is because they are also seeing that they don't know. So the first question that these large institutions are saying that we don't know where our data is, right? Or where all our data is, A. And B, we also don't know what is personal amongst the data that we collect, right? Or what is personal amongst the data that we process, right? So these two are the questions that larger institutions are trying to grapple their hands around. And as we get into this process of discovering, they themselves are discovering more and more, which they never thought, let's say, existed in their institution at some shape, size, or form. Coming back to your question, Pushkal, what we are seeing essentially is that it will take roughly about 18 to 24 months is what larger institutions possibly estimate. And see, this also involves the gap assessment. Well, we put in a name of gap assessment, but essentially, if you look at every journey, we will have to start right from the, let's say, the account opening form to say that what are the personal data that we are collecting, and look at either data minimization to say that do we need so much of data, or can we, let's say, rationalize that data, right? So that's basic point number one, which needs to be done by a individual business to business, individual lines of business. So for a credit card, it will be different. For a debit card, it will be different. For a savings account, it will be different. For a housing loan, it will be different. For an educational loan, it will be different. So product by product, we will have to sit down and identify, saying that what are the data sets that we are collecting, and A, do we need to minimize it? That's first. Then second basically is to say that, okay, how does consent fit into this process? And where does consent fit into this process? Does it fit into right at the time? For example, in this scenario, agent collects data, right? So should the agent collect consent first, or should the agent collect the data and then take the consent along with the data? So those decisions have to be made. So some of these decision making, some of these process tweaks or process changes that needs to be done is actually at a individual process level. It cannot be done driven centrally saying that all processes needs to collect consent. It doesn't work that way. So you'll have to sit down saying that where there is an agent driven process, it is slightly different. In banks, especially in the tier 2, tier 3 areas, there is a banking correspondent concept where they basically source the customers. For lenders, there is a DSA concept, direct selling agents concept. So they then source the customers. Now, there are a lot of differences in the way in the processes through which we take this data. And therefore, for each of these areas, we need to identify saying that what are we doing today and what should we do tomorrow when DPDP is in force, and therefore what is the change that is needed in the process, and subsequently also what is the change that is needed in technology, because BFSI, as we all know, is 100% driven by technology. So any change in process, any change in SOP will need a change in technology. And all of us know that any change in technology has a long tail always, right? So even for a small change in technology, it will take at least 2 months, right? So just imagine the number of changes in processes and therefore the number of changes in technology, and therefore estimate what is the time that it will take from for each of these processes in that journey. And add to it now the complexity of there will be third parties that will be involved. So there will be security measures that needs to be implemented if it is not already along with the third parties. So that's a separate chapter by itself, right? Because let's say even in this journey, for example, a third party vendor will deliver our credit cards to our homes. It will not be the bank themselves which will come and deliver the third party credit card to our homes, which essentially means that there is a data change towards the vendors, and therefore there is PII data transfer, and therefore there is security required, and so on and so forth, right? So every step in this process will require consent. Every step in this process will require third parties. So that is the volume of assessment, or that is the volume of, let's say, number of changes that are required for each of our business processes, right? And as simple as somebody walking into your office and giving their photograph just as a measure of identification, which every office today does, right? Every building does. So let's say some visitor, some of your friends has come into your office, and he basically clicks his photograph and puts a signature on that tablet or whatever. Even that process has to change because you have to take his consent, right? So even that process has to change. So it's not only the business processes, but something as simple as an administrative process also needs to change, right? So we also need to look at that side of the story, right? And see how do we want to progress piece by piece, right? So that's why becomes very important for all of us to sit down and look at what are the changes that will come, and therefore should we, in my opinion, we should definitely start now if we have not already started.
Great. Thanks for that. Start now if you haven't already, is Dinesh's view. And I think, Dinesh, you raised a few really good points, right? First, you said that this touches every department, every flow, and the scale of this impact is unprecedented. You also said that when taking these calls, you have to make a lot of decisions, and that decision making takes its own time, right? And you have to account for the time for the decision making as well.
Yes.
And you spoke about the entire flow for gap assessments and data mapping and third party. We will get back into that question once I've gotten a chance to loop in Kailash as well. So Kailash, you are overseeing the launch of DPDP compliance journey at IIFL. Could you walk us through why you have started right now? What are the circumstances and reasons why IIFL has decided to start this journey right now?
Thanks, Pushkal. So, Pushkal, if you understand the overall BFSI industry, this manage the huge amount of the PI data. It's business start with the PI and end with the PI, if you consider, because they highly depending on this PI data. Now, when we start this journey, there are what that factor push us to initiate the journey. There are too many reasons to it, but I would highlight on a certain reason why we have selected this journey at this point of time. The first of all, this particular DPDP, it enforce certain process or the changes in the existing your organization process or the control. If you fail to do that, then there is a huge penalty to it, and there is a non-compliance to it, may lead to the customer dissatisfaction or reputational loss for the organization. The second most point, which I believe that it's a management actionable nowadays, because before the DPDP Act, privacy control or privacy implementation was not the key priority for the management. Now, if you look at all your steering committee presentation, board committee presentation, it is the become an agenda that cannot be overlooked. Hence, it is the board actionable now. If any breaches or penalty from the regulator or government, nobody wants that sort of action on their organization. Now, my team actually saw to the group entity. We are into the lending, we are into the home loan, we are into the broking, insurance, health. So if you look, all my entities, they deal with the PI information. So all these entities are comes under the DPDP compliance purview. Now, DPDP enforce obligations around the data privacy, consent management, cross-border data transfer, grievance redressal. There are too many things wherein, as Dinesh suggested, the process need to be changed, technical controls need to be evaluated. Otherwise, it will be a huge loss to the BFSI industry if they haven't started yet, because it will take a long time to implement, because any small change in the process take a more than 3 months, like a consent management. Like I believe most of the organization might be taking a consent, but are those explicit in nature? Are those acknowledged or present by the notice given to the data principal? So this maybe we can say that we have a consent management process in the place, but is it adequate? Is it meeting the DPDP compliance requirement? Then third point, which I feel like that many of our existing processes, system or application is not designed considering that privacy compliance in the mind. It's a legacy system. So too many changes is required. Now, even if you look at the roles and the responsibilities of Chapter 1 of the DPDP lay foundations on the framework and define key terms such as data principal, data fiduciary, consent manager. Now, defining and operationalizing this particular roles in the BFSI is very difficult, because multiple partners, BFSI is heavily depend on their partners and third parties to carry out the businesses. And all these are actually handling the data collaterally. So if you don't do it now, it would be very late for the organization. Dinesh rightly touch on the third party, because as I said, we are extensively outsource the operation to my vendor, fintech partner, my payment gateway, all the application talks to the API wherein I have integrations with too many third party wherein I am sharing my API with them. No centralized inventory or the visibility what is happening on a third party may lead to major non-compliance. And the last one, which I feel like that my structure or the unstructured data, what we are storing in our environment, that is the major issue for the BFSI, because if you don't have an insight on what you're storing, and if you're not working on the data minimization at this point of time, then it would be difficult for them. I think this is the right time to take a step forward to understand the current state, addressing the challenges, and building the scalable roadmap to meet this DPDP compliance requirement.
Got it. Thanks for that, Kailash. You touched upon similar points about that Dinesh did, but you also mentioned that it has become a management priority now because of the risk involved, because of the reputational risk as well as the monetary risk. You also spoke about the problem with legacy systems and legacy processes, how technically and operationally this is something that is going to take us a long time to get done. That's why seeing this time, you should get started now. You also touched upon data discovery, which is something that we will come back to in the next section. So the next section is about how do you get started, right? And so Kailash, hold on to that thought. But I'll just like to pull in Dinesh here, starting from the thing that he was saying earlier about what a gap assessment is about. It's about looking at where you are, looking at all your processes, looking at where you need to get to, understanding consent, understanding third-party dependencies. We have all heard of gap assessment, Dinesh, and we are often intimidated by how voluminous these reports can be. So my question to you is, what is a gap assessment really about? If you could put it in the simplest way possible, and if today I have to start a gap assessment, what is the first step or the first goal that I should pick up with my gap assessment?
So see, basically gap assessment and data discovery will go hand in hand. So we first need to understand in the first place which functions are applicable for DPDP and which functions are not, because certain functions may not be even touching personal data, right? So that is my first sort of self-assessment or self-review or whatever you want to call. Then, okay, so if there are X number of functions out of which Y number of functions will process personal data, which will be in case of DPDP, I have seen more than 90%, generally, more than 90%. So now once we identify that Y from X, then we say that, okay, where is the personal data coming in from in terms of the channels? From a BFSI perspective, it could be, let's say, an agency channel. It could be a bank assurance channel. If it was an insurance company, it could be a fintech channel, etc., right? So we identify where is the customer data that is basically coming in from, and therefore what is the purpose for which I am taking the customer data for, or for that matter, why customer, any individual's data for. It is also applicable for candidates that we are actually attempting to interview as well. So any individual's data for, and then sit down and say that how are we processing that data, where are we sharing that data down the line. And then from a gap assessment, there are again two parts to this. One is an organizational and process related controls, saying that do we take consent, which obviously in many cases we do, but it may not be aligned to DPDP, but at least today we take consent from an FS standpoint, right? So whether we are taking that consent, whether we are storing the data properly, whether we are sharing the data across appropriately, and from a technology standpoint, is it access controlled? Are there encryption measures? Are there, is the data in rest and in motion encrypted? Are there audit trails and so on and so forth? So those are my technology measures or technical measures. So then we sit down and say that, okay, where all consent is required in this process, and then start to figure out saying that, okay, so if this process, I am putting the consent here, how will I verbiage the consent in a manner that I don't go back to the customer again and again for reconsent? Because customer experience is also a very important component in a sale of DPDP, right? Which essentially means that, sorry, in a sales process for a financial services company. So essentially we need to balance the consent mechanism as well as balance the customer experience along with it as well, right? So we need to look at how are we going to take the consent, how many times are we going to take the consent in the process, and therefore how is our technology capable currently to enable that consent, and where all do we need to get integrated. Now there will be certain downstream applications. So if I take a, let's say, lending example, right? So there will be a core lending system, but there will also be a CRM system, and then there will be, let's say, an LOS or a loan origination system, right? So if we are taking, let's say, the consent at a CRM level for the entire process, we may choose to not take consent when we are processing personal data in the core lending system, right? So depends upon how we are structuring the process, right? So we need to evaluate each of these areas and then say that, okay, now I have these 20 things that I need to do for this specific lending process, right? And similarly for process number 2, process number 3, process number 4, and so on and so forth. Then what we do is, okay, we sit down and understand, okay, what are the common themes that are emerging from these gaps, from these process-wise gaps, and then try and see if some of them or most of them or many of them can be centrally driven through the DPO office. Because it's a policy mandate, so then it can be centrally driven, right? But there will be certain account opening forms, for example, which each line of business will have its own changes. So obviously that cannot be centrally driven. But some of these larger pieces around saying that how are we going to take consent, etc., can be centrally driven. So you'll have to sit down and decide saying that how many of the gaps are very similar. Data retention, for example, would be a typical gap, but it will be different for different processes. So how much can we centralize it? So this is the sort of broad brush that I can say for a typical gap assessment that we often call it, right? But I believe that it should be probably gap assessment plus or gap assessment star or whatever you want to put, because this is not typically a gap assessment saying that on the left hand side you have a set of rules and on the right hand side you tick a checkbox saying that, okay, this is there, this is not. That doesn't work beyond a point. You just have to get into each processes to say, how do you do it? So some of these learnings have obviously come in the last 12, 18 months, but that's something which I'm sharing.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. That really helps simplify what a gap assessment is really about, instead of, as you said, just a table. If I were to just distill the points that you said in 3 simple steps, the first one is to understand for any flow, are you using personal data at all? That is the step 1. If you are using personal data, you move to step 2. Now, step 2, you ask yourself, whose data am I processing? What data am I processing? Why am I processing this data? What am I doing with this data? And where am I sharing this data? You ask yourself some basic questions, and that creates your data mapping, which is what we see on our screen right now. And then you take each line item in the data mapping and start applying controls and processes. This can be about information security. This can be about policy. This can be about data retention timelines, cross-border transfers, consent mechanism. This whole thing can be applied line by line across this data mapping. So data mapping becomes the control center of your compliance, and your entire governance structure can be set up based on this. Just a follow-up question, Dinesh, which is the longest time-taking process in this?
No, this entire process of discovering the data and defining what the gaps are, and therefore, see, to my point, I am not too worried about whether we are defining the gaps. I am more worried about saying that what is the next step that we need to take from an implementation standpoint. So getting to an implementation roadmap or implementation actionables, if I want to look at it that way, that is significantly time taking, because you'll have to basically go around the entire institution, right? And the bigger the institution is, the wider the spread is, the crazier it becomes, right? So it is what it is, right? If it is a fintech, obviously number of individuals are lesser, and therefore it is much more tech enabled. So obviously the process becomes significantly easier. But if it is much more people driven, agents driven, DSA driven, BC driven, etc., then it becomes that much more difficult. And we'll have to centralize a lot of these controls, because there are a lot many more people who are interacting with the customers, and therefore a lot many more SOP driven, process driven, control driven has to happen, because otherwise each individual can interpret the DP Act and their own SOPs and policies and procedures in their own fashion, and things can go for a toss. So essentially the training part and the SOP driven and the process driven part, distilling that into the culture of the organization, I think will probably take the longest time in this entire privacy journey.
And those policies and procedures you can only come up with once you have this visibility, right?
Yes.
So if you have to even get to the policies and procedures, you have to complete this exercise pronto. Otherwise, you're just going to get stuck.
Yes.
Got it. Yeah, we had a couple of questions. I hope this answers. One question was developing a privacy framework. Is that required before gap assessment? Based on this response, I think in order to develop the framework, you need to do the gap assessment first and the data mapping first. And another question about difference between gap assessment and risk assessment. I think gap assessment is a holistic view. Risk assessment is something that we will come to in our discussion. So that hold on to that question, please. But really want to quickly touch base with Kailash also. Kailash, you have started doing data discovery at IIFL, and all of this data mapping is, as we discussed, it's a huge organizational exercise. So how do you think data discovery is going to help with data mapping, help you get this control that you need over your data flows? And what challenges do you see in doing data discovery in an organization of your size?
Okay, so see, when we talk about the data mapping or data discovery, there are multiple approach that you can follow. The one is during the gap assessment, you can have a RUPA or DFD in a place, which will give you the insight on how the data is flowing within your organization. What are the touch points where you are collecting, and eventually where you are disposing that particular data, which personal data attributes are being used, which third party are involved. However, the problem what we have observed that data is spread across multiple system application. Further, this resources spread across in-house, cloud, hybrid. Now, to bring that clarity when you have a huge network and interconnected system, manually it is really not possible. Just it's again manual data mapping methods are, I believe it's a time consuming. Sometimes it is not inefficient for the modern architecture or the huge network. because it's depend on allocated time and the person who is actually answering to those questions. If you miss out on something, probably you will miss out on some critical potential risks for the organization. So first, I think data discovery and data mapping, you should have both the elements. One is the manual and the one is the automated. The automated way will help you to identify all this data attributes in your structure and unstructured data. If you look at my organization, we have a huge data set. We have a huge multiple databases and the file storage. Now, from the databases, again, there are different challenges for the databases. You have a multiple table and you have to identify the table which holds a PI so that you can have a proper technical controls to safeguard those particular tables. In the unstructured data, nobody knows what exactly lying in your system, who is storing what, in what format. Are these data is being shared with any third party without any authorization? So this mapping will give you the upper hand on managing the entire thing. It will whenever you are doing the mapping, I said that whenever you want to do a, or maybe you want to do a fulfill the data principal rights. If someone has raised a request for data access or data erasure, that clarity you will get it from the data discovery where exactly you are storing data. Second things that there is a too much of duplications of the data. You have a certain things in one database and the same thing is being stored in another database, or same things you might lying into your file storage. It's unnecessary utilizing your resources, but it is adding some administrative cost to the organization to meet the compliance requirement. I think what we face the challenge that most are the addressing the false positive. If you're working on the data mapping or data discovery and this is not giving the accurate where exactly you're storing PI, which attributes you're storing, whether it falls into the PI category or not, then it's a work for entire team. And the fourth one that's majorly important is that now all the regulators, if you consider the RBI or SEBI, they are also pushing for data automated data discovery for your structure and unstructured data.
Got it. Got it. Thanks so much for that, Kailash. You talked about how discovery gives you a more clearer view of what data you're processing, which can be missed out in manual processes. It can also be faster, but you also pointed towards the pitfalls of it, right? About false positives and how do you make sure that this data discovery, the size it covers and everything, how do you make sure it happens properly? You also interestingly touched upon how you can remove data duplication, which is not just an administrative cost, it's also a privacy risk. So you're able to better organize your data once you have this visibility on it. So question to Dinesh on this, is there any sort of data discovery that cannot be done in an automated way, that still requires those interviews? What gaps do you foresee in running this data discovery process that require a manual sort of interview-based or discussion-based approach?
No, see, so even to identify what is personal data in the first place requires manual intervention, right? Any tool in the market cannot come back and tell you that for this particular kind of business, these are the sets of personal data that will happen, right? So the very first starting point in itself has to be manual input to the data discovery tool saying that these are the sets of personal data that the tool needs to look at in the first place. The second problem that I see in is unstructured data. And then how are we going to look at, and Kailash also alluded to this earlier as well, saying that how are we going to look at unstructured data, especially in a financial services organization where unstructured data can be in images, in PDFs, sent over emails, etc., etc. And there is almost no control on it. Right? No control in the sense, no control within the organization. Probably there is a DLP which is preventing it from going outside the organization, which is fair, right? But within the organization, it is just passing across the board. So how do you identify saying that where are those data sets located? And therefore then point out saying that there is this shared drive which has, let's say, unstructured data in the form of PDFs, for example, right? So some of these will definitely need manual input, intervention, whichever way you want to call it. And also, I believe that this cannot be a first time right process. So the manual plus automated will still cover maybe whatever number you want to put, 70%, 80%, 85%, whatever it is. But to incrementally achieve, we will have to do it thrice over to say that, okay, how do we take that 80% to, let's say, 90%, etc. And there will still be surprises that you will see that X personal data we never incorporated in our tool. Neither did we get hold of this in our manual, in our discussions. Now has suddenly cropped up because every institution starts off with new products, new processes at any given point of time. That's a very dynamic environment, especially in a financial services piece. So as you are running this process for over 6 months or 9 months, there are definitely going to be newer products that are going to be launched. And for all, they might want to ask something new which was never asked before. So this has to be a sort of, how should I say, incremental process over a period of time. So that those are my sort of 3 inputs where I believe that there is a significant manual intervention that is required, and it cannot be just press of a button and tool will run and then data discovery will happen. It doesn't work that way.
Absolutely. Lots of stuff to dig into here, but I'm conscious of time. So we will move to the third party challenges, something both of you all spoke about. But yeah, just to conclude on that, I think Kailash, you spoke about how it's efficient to look at data using a data discovery application and all the benefits of that and the needs for that. And Dinesh, you spoke about how there needs to be a feedback loop, right? There needs to be a sort of a manual plus automated process that happens incrementally and iteratively. You're going to have to improvise with a lot of manual intervention. So third parties, we touched upon third parties. I think Kailash and Dinesh both touched upon third parties in their introductory comments that third parties are a risk, and third parties from an InfoSec point of view are your weakest links. This is common understanding. Your own apps and agents, at least you have full control. You have your DLP, you have your processes and all of that. But when it comes to third party agents, you don't, right? Now, when you look at BFSI, you're also looking at a very fractured industry. Like your collection agencies are highly geographical. Telemarketing is highly fractured, right? Your DSAs, your BCs, these are very small players who may not be so tech enabled, may not be so tech forward. Dinesh, coming back to you, what are some key considerations that a BFSI business should keep in mind while evaluating third party flows and contracts? And strategically, how should they approach this? Are there any strategies that you can talk about? Firstly, like how should you approach this? And secondly, any strategies that you can give off the hook?
Yeah, so quickly 2 points. Basically, first we have to identify which are my most critical third parties from a data transfer perspective. And can we get the work done without transferring the personal data in the first place, right? And therefore remove that third party from a DPDP compliance equation itself, right? While we may still sign contracts, this, that, etc. But we see if we can, let's say, mask some of the data or jumble up some of the data, anonymize, pseudonymize, do all of that to remove the personal data elements from the data that is getting transferred to the third party. So try and basically look at removing the third party from the equation. The second way that we can probably tackle it, and this is for where I'm assuming that we are retaining all the third parties the way we are doing right now, right? I'm not saying that we are dismissing some of the third parties because they don't agree to our contracts, etc. I'm assuming that we are going by the current BAU scenario. The second strategy that I have seen that people are probably looking at applying, and again, this is an evolving space, so we need to see how this moves on, is saying that how can we bring in some of the third party resources because they are skilled, and therefore we can bring them into our own network and get them to work on our own laptops and our own IT environment and so on. So again, it goes back to my first scenario that we are not transferring any data from our side to the third party itself, right? But now a lot of processes cannot happen here because let's say, for example, if you have to courier a credit card to a particular individual, that cannot happen from the bank itself, right? So there you will have to share. Now, some of those things we'll have to evaluate whether we want to continue working with, let's say, a smaller third party, or is there an alternative available. Costs again will increase because obviously if you go in with a smaller third party, the costs are lesser. If you go in with a brand name, the costs are slightly higher, etc., etc. So some of these will be the pros and cons that we'll have to debate to understand how are we going to do this. And lastly, I will also want to mention that from a third party standpoint, also there will be a significant pushback. right? Because even they need to comply to DPDP. So they will not want to take a lot of liability from the primary institutions, right? So they will also have their own legal lawyers, etc., who will advise them against taking certain clauses from their data fiduciaries, right? There is that element also that we will have to contend with. And here I'm assuming we are proxying for the BFSI institutions per se, right? So these are some of the considerations that we will have to look at. But having said that, this is a very evolving scene. Probably we'll have to wait for some more time. To see how this plays out.
Yeah, really interesting insights, Dinesh. I think the bottom line idea is take the transfers are risky, take the data transfer out of the equation. So can you not send personal data to your third-party vendor? Can you bring them with,
that's the ideal scenario, right? So you remove the risk only from the equation instead of trying to manage or mitigate it. So that will be my first, because the risk here is very high, which is why I'm trying to see whether we can remove the risk only from the equation.
Absolutely. And the other approach of bringing them into the fold with your VPNs and everything. Just a note to all the audience, we are almost toward the end of this discussion. Please post we'll do a 5-minute Q&A right at the end of this. So please post all your questions. We are looking at your questions and we will make sure that we can have them answered, as many of them as possible. So please post your questions in chat and we will take those up. But before we get to that, just one final question on this to Kailash also. Kailash, third-party risk assessments take a lot of time. And especially IIFL is running multiple businesses in multiple sectors. So you would have the same vendor maybe that you would use for 2 businesses and many such things that can come up. So as a mid to large BFSI that looks like IIFL or wants to be an IIFL, firstly, what are the pitfalls that you can think about when you look at third-party risk assessments, doing them at such a big scale when it comes to DPDP? And secondly, what are some optimizations that you can do? What are some sort of shortcuts, if there are any, tweaks that you can bring in so that this whole process gets optimized, it becomes faster, less manual work, etc., etc.
Okay. So I think Dinesh has covered almost all the risks associated it and work around related it. But just few things I would like to highlight first from the third party vendor management or the risk assessment perspective. The first one is that since we are a group organization, I think whatever we are sharing in an internal, because for the internal group data sharing agreement is not in a place, that is also a non-compliance for in your organization if you look from the third party or the risk assessment perspective. So that's the one thing that we are taking care internally and defining the purpose of sharing or the access control or security safeguard should be maintained. As you rightly touch on that there are multiple vendors who is providing services to our multiple entities. And one challenge that what we are facing, that as DPDP and the regulatory is enforced to conduct the audit for your third party, there are lots of duplications and efforts are putting to evaluate their rates. There are the different risks being highlighted by the different team. So we are trying to how we can consolidate it or how we can, streamline this process from the operational perspective. This major There are too many vendors where they don't have a basic awareness about the DPDP or the technical hygiene that needs to be maintained to safeguard the PI. So we are identifying such vendors so that maybe we can stop sharing the PI with them, or other workaround can be identified so that there should not be any problem to the organization in the longer run. One more, I think, issue wherein we are working, that we are spreading the awareness among the vendors, because what we have observed that specifically SMEs and the startup, they are not fully aware on their responsibility under the DPDP. Some additional efforts is required to educate them and enforce them to comply with the DPDP requirement.
Yeah, that actually is a great segue to one of the questions. If third-party vendors do not agree to your data protection requirements, what should be the recourse? Because the burden of liability is on data fiduciary. Kailash, I imagine you've navigated a lot of these.
End of the day, whatever we do, that business risk is associated with the business. So all these points get discussed with the businesses, and some alternate options are not available, then that risk acceptance should be happen, and it should get highlighted to your board members, so that if tomorrow board decided that we don't want to do the business considering the complications or the other penalties from the regulatory, that decision can be made. Because I think not a single team can take a decision. We, during the gap assessment or evaluation, we can identify it, we can evaluate this risk and highlight it to the board member, and that should be the right approach, I believe.
Got it. Got it. Dinesh, we're getting some confusion around the different types of assessments. So there is gap assessment. What is the difference between a gap assessment, a DPIA, and a data management maturity assessment? And which of these will help you with DPDP compliance? That's the question.
To be honest, I myself get confused with a lot of these, let's say, for a lack of better word, jargons. The simple point is we need to do an assessment across our people in terms of whether we have adequate people, adequate training, adequate process, adequate people, adequate training to run data privacy centrally as well as at each department level. We need to assess each process to say where consent is required, what needs to be done, where data retention is required, what needs to be done. And then we obviously bring that down to technology, to say that what technology capabilities should we need to build in. Do we need an additional privacy enhancing solution from which needs to be brought in from outside, which will manage the consents? Do we need a DLP, IDAM, IRM? All of these are assessments that needs to be done from a technology standpoint for data protection as well as data privacy, right? So any assessment which does not cover, any assessment which covers all these aspects needs to be done. Right now, we can give whatever name that we want, saying that is this a risk assessment or a gap assessment or a DPIA. That's more nomenclature. That's how I would like to put it.
Yeah, rose by any name, right? It will still be a rose.
It does not matter, to be honest. And
Yeah.
DPIA, as called out in the DPDP Act, is largely applicable for significant data fiduciaries. So I would rather suggest, if you want to get down to a DPIA, probably you should wait for the rules to say that who is an SDF versus who is not, before sitting down and getting to start a DPIA.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think very clear answer. It doesn't matter what you call it. Look at your people, look at your process, and look at your technology. Figure out what all controls are needed over there. One, I think, last question that we have here is, should we look at consent now or wait for the rules, or just data discovery along with purpose and data flows, including third parties? I think this whole presentation has been about answering that question. Basically, I would leave it to you also, Dinesh, to add to it. But just to summarize our discussion, you need to start with your data discovery. You need to start with your gap assessments, figuring out where consent fits in as a planning motive right now, figuring out where consent fits in, and then looking at also your controls, specifically looking at your third parties, because that is also going to take a lot of time. But Ash, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think that's fair.
Okay, fantastic. So unfortunately, we are out of time. We will please keep sending us these questions. I think if we can share the slide and move to the next slide, we will put a QR for a minute where you can fill out the form and reach out to us with your questions. We will try to set up another one of these. This was really informative and insightful. We learned a lot from this. We also have a demo section now. So as part of the demo, we actually wanted to walk you through data. Yeah, this is the QR. You can scan these QRs and reach out to us, and someone from our team will be in touch with you. You can ask us these questions and we'll be happy to help you out. We also were going to do a demo. I understand that we are nearing the time of this, the end time for this webinar. So if anybody can stay for longer, they can see the demo. Let me just double check if I've covered all the questions. DPDP applies from what date is a question that we have here. So I think if you ask 3 people, you will get 4 dates. Dinesh, what is your view on which date it starts from?
Sorry, no view from my side. As of now, it is not applicable. Yes. As of now, it's not notified. Sorry, let me use a proper word. As of now, it's not notified. So when it will be notified, we don't know.
Yes. And I think some of these questions we have also covered in our presentation. For example, How will data flow diagrams help in privacy compliance? How detailed does it really need to be? I think we have had a specific discussion on this topic, so we can share that recording with you and you'll be able to access the answer there. One final question is, what if you were to just list out the policies that should be created by under this act, what all policies are we looking at? Any one of you, Kailash, Dinesh?
Kailash, you want to take this?
As of now, we as an organization, we are working on the privacy policy, cookies policy, data privacy policy, and the procedure. These are the documents wherein we are working and upgrading, enhancing as per the DPDP requirement. No specific policy as such we are creating, but yes, lots of process enhancement we are doing. We are working on the procedure part, how the consent management process should be followed, which are the process should be identified, wherein consent should be taken from the data principle. So this kinds of things are happening, but the policy perspective, we have a high level policy on information and cyber security, and then data privacy policy and the procedure.
Dinesh, would you like to add to that?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so no, I think fair point from Kailash. And obviously, it also depends upon what are the policies that are already existing with the organization, right? And therefore, obviously, the necessity of adding more policies will reduce to a large degree if some of those are already there with the organization. And if it's an RBI controlled RE, a regulated entity, then obviously there are quite a few which should be existing even as of today with or without DPDP. So it will be lot much more to say that review what we have today, probably update some of them, and then look at saying that if there are any additional policies that needs to be created potentially. So I would probably take that approach, saying that let me look at all my policies that we already have and then see what needs to be updated, and based on that then look at any additional policies that needs to be added. Because whenever you add on a policy, you basically add on more policy compliance to you. So you generally don't want to do it in a normal course of business.
Got it. All right. So yeah, I think we started at 12:05. We are at 1:02. That is for the discussion. Thank you so much, Dinesh and Kailash, for being a part of it. We also so we were going to do a demo next, but before that, any concluding thoughts from Kailash and Dinesh?
Great discussion. Thank you so much, Pushkal, and the entire legality team.
It was our pleasure.
Thanks, Pushkal and legality team for inviting me for this discussion.
Yes, it was our pleasure. We really needed this practical insight, and I think both of you all, with your insights and all the information that you shared, complemented each other really well, and it was really, really pleasant for me to ask all these questions to all of you all and get this insight.
Thank you.
I hope the audience got some good takeaways from this session. Some of your questions that you think may not have been answered, we will separately send a written FAQ with all of these questions answered after this session. So if we were not able to cover it right now, be assured we will share written answers to all of these questions. Some of them we will summarize, others that we could not pick up, we are going to add the answers. Now, with this, I would like to conclude the discussion. We will move on to our demo. So those of you who have 15 minutes to stick around for the demo, please do stick around. So in this demo, we plan to show you the whole process of how data discovery, gap assessment, and data mapping can all work together and create and integrate a consent, and all of it result in integrating a consent collection and withdrawal flow in a process. But unfortunately, we don't have the time for that. But we will still take a look at data discovery that has been spoken about a lot in this session. So for that, I would like to introduce Siddhant Ramachandran, Sid. He's the head of product at Leegality, and he has been doing a lot of really interesting work around data discovery, data visibility, and he's the driving force behind our data discovery application, Consentin Lens. Over to you, Sid, for this quick demo.
Thanks, Pushkal. I'll just quickly screen share. Thanks for that very insightful session, and thanks to the panelists and all the members of the audience who took out time to join us. So really excited to very quickly show you a brief overview of our product, which can get you started with data discovery. I hope my screen is visible. Pushkal, if you could confirm that.
Yes, I can see.
Yeah. Great. So we talked a lot about data discovery and why we need to get started with it. I'll just very quickly give a recap. First of all, as Dinesh pointed out, data discovery is the foundation for carrying out gap assessment. The step one for any organization to start getting in a position to comply with DPDP is to know what data you have and whether you have PII or not. Right. So data discovery is basically a product based automated way for you to scan all your data sources so that you get a very detailed and accurate picture of where you have data, what kind of data do you have, and what kind of data is PII, right? So that really lays the foundation for you to then create a data map to assess, do you have the relevant consent? Do you need to make any changes in your consent process? What purposes are you collecting the data for? Once you have that visibility, you can figure out who am I sharing the data with, right? So this is really the groundwork for carrying out any sort of gap assessment, building any sort of data map, and putting in place a reliable sort of compliance framework for the DPDP, right? So that's the first and most important key benefit of performing data discovery. The second aspect is that, again, this lays the foundation for you to appropriately manage your data security posture, right? Again, this is something that the panelists talked about with multiple examples. So once you know that you have a certain data source where there is a very high degree of PII concentration, you can then empower your data teams, your security team, your infra teams to actually manage that security risk, right? Some of the examples the panelists talked about was data deduplication. So do you have the same data in multiple places? Can you just reduce that exposure and reduce the surface area of risk? That's one measure that you can take. We also talked about encrypting the data where necessary. So if there's a very big table with a lot of sensitive data, you can then take the call to maybe encrypt it appropriately with additional security measures in place. You can also ensure that the appropriate sharing configurations have been put in place, right? So if there is a specific database, a specific schema, or a specific bucket which has a lot of PI, you need to ensure that those are not publicly accessible, or that they need to be accessible only from inside your VPN, things like that, right? So a very important benefit here is that it allows you to manage your security posture appropriately. And thirdly, data discovery also lays the foundation for you to fulfill data subject rights requests from your data principles, right? So this is something that Pushkal talked about even in the digital lending guidelines, wherein you will have to give rights to your customers for data erasure, and you'll have to serve their data subject rights requests. So for you to be able to reliably and accurately serve those requests, to serve data back to your data principals, to serve deletion requests, to serve amendment requests, you first need to know what data you have, right? So again, discovery gives you a catalog so that you can accurately and reliably serve this. At an overall level, this sort of product lays down the foundation of your entire compliance regime for the DPDP. Now, very quickly, we'll talk about some specific points about our product, which is called Lens, that helps you perform data discovery, and why that's a really good fit for large organizations. First of all, our product is built to be fully comprehensive. So we'll cover all sorts of data, right? Dinesh talked about the fact that you'll have data in a lot of places. Kailash talked about the fact that you'll have structured, unstructured data. Our application is designed to cover all sorts of data, whether it's structured, unstructured, file stores, third-party data sources. Everything will be covered in the same application. So it gives you a 360-degree view. The version of the product that we have live and we are in the process of deploying with some really large BFSI enterprises is the structured databases. That's the best place to start. That's the most important and easiest place to start. So whether you have MySQL data, Postgres data, whatever it is, all of that is supported within our application. Secondly, we've built this product keeping in mind a lot of learnings from our core product. So full flexibility is something that you'll get with our application. So you decide what kind of speed you want to run the scans on, what kind of infra you want. Do you want to run the scan on the entire data source or a specific part of the data source? Do you want to run scans at a specific time of the day? Is there any part of the data you want to include or exclude? The type of data scan you want to run. We have full flexibility here. So you can run a comprehensive data scan that scans every single record, or we can run quick scans, which just smartly scan some parts of the data to give you a very good idea, right? So there is a lot of flexibility here so that you can run scans and perform discovery in the way that you want. And lastly, this is entirely secure and self-hosted, right? So this is not a SaaS product on the cloud. This is run on your cloud environment or on your private servers. So it's entirely locked down and in your control. No PII leaves your environment and comes to us, right? So this is entirely and completely in your control, right? So those are some of the interesting features that are suitable for large BFSI customers so that the application is tailor-made for your requirements. Now, with that, I'll quickly walk you through some of the core capabilities of the application itself. I hope you can see the application dashboard itself.
Yes.
Great. Very quickly, you'll get a dashboard like this. This is also deployed on your environment. So again, nothing is traveling to Leegality here, completely in your control, but your teams will be able to see a dashboard like this, and you'll get to see some metadata around the scans performed, how many instances of PII you've detected, how many data source you've scanned. It gives you an overview of your data catalog. So which kinds of PII are most frequently found in your databases, which kinds of PII are occurring at what kind of frequencies. You get all sorts of visibility there. And you can deep dive into this by going to the data catalog, right? So here you can see that you have an extremely high concentration of email, and you can see that high concentration is in a specific database called the MySQL internal database, right? So at a very high level, it gives you this kind of information, right? And this is something that's available for all sorts of PII types. And you can switch the view to look at different data sources as well. So we can see that we have a database here with a very high concentration of PII and another one that is a really small concentration, right? So this allows your teams to appropriately address your security posture, right? You know now that, okay, this is where we need to start from. This is where the security risk is high. This is where you need to perform scans first, and then you can come to the smaller databases. Now, the interesting thing is that you can actually drill down and look at a specific category in a lot of detail. So let's say we are looking at the PII type of emails, right? Let's look at where emails are, right? So you can see the broader distribution here at a high level of different databases. But very interestingly, and this is the core value out of the product, we can drill down to a specific database and see exactly where we have detected emails, right? And this is where you can see the various unique places in this database where we've managed to find emails, right? This is a total of 60 unique places in a single database where we found email, and we found it in places where the column name is contact, the column name is username, the column name is remarks, right? And the column name is email. Now, this is something that typically takes businesses by surprise. It's very difficult to perform this activity manually, right? Maybe you can check it out maybe you can cover very obvious fields which are named email, but it's very difficult to know that inside the remarks column, you have an email ID as well, right? So this is the core value add. You get very granular idea of what kind of data you have, where do you have PII, so that now when you get a deletion request, your teams know where all you need to clean the data from. Or alternatively, let's say you want to rationalize this, right? You don't want emails to be there in 60 places, right? Like maybe there's some duplicacy here. So you can now empower your engineers, your data security officers to appropriately perform minimization or deduplication activities, right? Your DevOps team can now look at this database and ensure that it's completely locked down, that maybe there is double encryption here, or that very tight access controls are applied because of the number of instances of PII, right? So this is the kind of drill down view that you get. The other thing I wanted to talk about, which Kailash spoke about, was the concern around false positives, right? So just to give you an idea of how this works, the application runs scans for you. So for each data source, you run scans, and we go over the data source and look at the data and figure out where PII is likely to be, right? Now, often businesses find that when you run an automated solution, there are a lot of false positives, right? We, on the other hand, basis feedback from the industry, we've made a lot of optimizations to minimize false positives in the system. So our ML models look at not just the values that are there in your database, but we look at other metadata as well, such as the column name, the overall concentration of PI, etc., to give you a confidence score of PII, so that false positives are reduced to the extent possible, right? So that's the kind of overview that you are likely to get here. And if you can see that this is the result of performing a scan. So at a high level, in this particular schema, you have 7 types of PI detected, and you get a granular view of where you can look at specific tables, specific columns for PII, right? So you'll get a visualization like this, which you can click through and go down to column level, right? To figure out where PII has been detected, right? This is very helpful to make sense of very large databases and very large tables. But very quickly, let's look at a specific table here. So we have a procurement request table. We've seen that 3 types of PII have been detected. We have a very good confidence score here associated with these detections. You can click through and review this right now. So you can see that samples have been surfaced for human review as well. All of this is done with a view to reduce false positives, right? You get a confidence score, you get samples, and additionally, your teams are empowered to look at this data and review it, right? So somebody from your team can come and review and check, is this actually an address, right? Is this something that is correctly detected? If it is, you can hit confirm and publish, or otherwise you can make edits and add data categories or delete data categories if there's something gone wrong, right? So whilst there is a lot of heavy use of AI and ML here, humans are still in the loop. Your teams can look at this data, review the data, and perform appropriate actions, right? So that's another core part of the application I wanted to highlight. And lastly, very quickly to show you that what kind of configurability you have, we already spoke about it in the slide set. The application is designed to be fully flexible. So you get a lot of configurations out of the box, right? For example, so the way to use this application is that you create a scan profile. The scan profile has a lot of your configurations as per your choice, right? So you can decide what type of data scan you want to run, whether you want to run a quick scan or a full scan. We touched upon this in the earlier part of the demo where we told you that we can scan entire databases, every single row, or alternatively just a few rows smartly as per your requirements. So you can choose the scan type. You can decide how fast you want to run the scan. So you can configure worker pods. This is basically the infrastructure you're provisioning. The more infra you provision, the faster your scan results. So that is also something that is in your control. You can include and exclude specific parts of the schema and specific parts of data sources. So again, helpful visualizations there as well to help you include or exclude certain paths. And tons of configurations here on what the permitted start and end time is in case you don't want scans to interfere with your regular uptime. What kind of sampling do you want? We saw samples right now when we were looking at the human review process. So you can define the depth of the samples. You can define whether you want to mask samples. You can define the depth of the scan. So a whole host of configurations, right? Another point I want to talk about is that the application also allows you to perform incremental scans. So this is something that Dinesh talked about as well, right? Once you do a first scan, you will reach, let's say 95% of confidence, but your teams will constantly update data sources. More and more data is getting added, but you don't want to scan the whole thing again, right? So if you use incremental scans, then we'll only scan newer data, newer parts of the data sources, so that incrementally, as you lead up to the date of finally the rules being released, you're in a very good place using features like that, right? So whole host of configurability. There's a lot we can talk about. I'd love to have a deep demo with all of you, but yeah, this is a full enterprise grade application. You get full role-based access control with granular access control basis roles for specific users. So all of that comes out of the box for you. But I hope that you got an overview of the key features of the application and how it works. So I'll just pause there and happy to take questions.
Yeah, we have some questions for you in the chat, Sid. First one is, suppose any PII data is encrypted at rest. Is your solution able to identify PII from the encrypted string of data set?
So that's a very good question. So that depends on the kind of encryption that has happened. So we've seen that there are 2 types of encryption that happen typically. One is that all the cloud providers, major platform providers, they provide encryption at rest as a part of the application. And because we have connectors for all of these cloud providers like AWS, the cloud providers automatically decrypt the data and give it to us. So we are able to read those data, right? So the data that I was showing you, all of that is actually encrypted, and we are able to decrypt it because when we connect to AWS, our integration is built in a way where the native encryption that AWS provides, that is something that we can decrypt. However, if you're doing additional encryption on top of that, which is very custom to you and that requires access to some specific private keys to decrypt, maybe there's user specific encryption, then that is something we will not be able to access, right? By design. right? Because without those keys, you can't decrypt the data. So it depends. It really depends. The core encryption at cloud provider infra level is something that we are able to decrypt.
Got it. And is endpoint scanning possible? That's another question.
Endpoint scanning is that's again a good question. Endpoint scanning is something that is on our roadmap right now. What we are focusing on is structured data, but endpoint scanning is definitely something on our roadmap. If you're using our product, that is something that you can look forward to receiving by the end of the year.
Okay. That's great. Thanks, Sid, for that demo. I think we are done with the questions. Thanks for really tying together all the problems and challenges that were raised and the discussions around data discovery and showing us all a really applied version of that about how it would look in practice. Very quickly, I will also share my screen and kind of fill in the remaining context about how this data discovery, with data discovery, you see which data is in which system, right? But when you create a complete data mapping, you need to add further context of what is the purpose for which the data is being used, what is the processing activity that is happening on the data, and so on and so forth. And this is something that Dinesh mentioned that we will do it during gap assessments where we ask these questions to business unit heads. So using one good thing that we are doing with Consentin is that we are taking a very user-centric approach to data mapping. So you are able to create profiles, like data principal profiles on the platform, and you're able to do the data mapping that is relevant to that user, right? And that makes this whole process much simpler than it is in other tools. So you get a clear view for any user, you'll get a clear view of what are the purposes, processing activity, system, and data categories involved in that whole process. This you can create, but unfortunately, we don't have the time for me to show you that whole process. And also you can create your custom notices, right? So we have a custom notice builder where you're able to create the pop-ups, the user experiences that the users will see in the entire journey, including putting hyperlinks and translations and the entire shebang, all the requirements that you need to comply with the DP Act or with the digital lending directions or any other law that applies to you. So this is a sample example. I will quickly show you what this pop-up will look like. Here I can translate it to all of these languages. I can provide my consent. I can download this notice. I can see the privacy policy here. I can raise grievances and everything. So I can accept this, and at the back end, this will create a record for us where this entire data mapping gets attached to this one particular principal ID, right? So at the principal ID level, you're able to see the entire data mapping, download the notice and consent records. So just to very quickly show you, we have this integrated on our website as well. So if I want to download this compliance checklist, which you can download from our website, and I enter my details here and I click on download guide, I get this notice where I'm able to provide my consent and accept it. And once I've accepted it, this checklist opens up. So it gives you a view of how this will look in a integrated end-to-end flow. Again, we were super fast about this because we are already 25 minutes over time. I'm very glad that 28 of you are here to look at this, and we'd love to continue this conversation with you all. So do reach out to us through our website or scanning the QR, or we will be sending out emails to all of you. So in response to that email, you can raise these questions or any questions that you have, and we're happy to set up these sessions. I would just, I think, head towards concluding this session since there are no more questions also. Thank you so much, everybody, for showing up. We started this with the idea that you should know what you can do right now and whether you need to do anything right now. So I hope all of you all were able to walk away from this with the answers to those questions clear to you. I think with that, I'll wrap this up. Thank you so much, and have a good day.